It's time for Chess Chest!
What?
No.
Chess chest.
Welcome to another Down the Rabbit Hole video, and welcome to another episode of Chess Chest. Apologies, these have taken a little while. There were some bumps in the road, so got over those, and now I'm ready to continue this series, and I'm going to do it more often. Actually, I had a request from Ian Hunter. He was saying the other day, please give us more chess episodes. So there's definitely more coming, and they're going to be more frequent. For those who haven't seen what this is all about, I've actually talked about each of these pieces in turn, a little of their history, where they come from, and how they've changed over the years. And I'm hoping the wait has been worth it, because now we're going to talk about the most important piece on the entire board, and that is the queen. This piece is really central to the history or the origins of chess itself. She's also the most powerful piece. She's got a strange change in what has occurred for her over the years. It's going to be quite an interesting bunch of discussions. So, how did she become the most powerful piece? Why is it the queen? How did the female monarch become associated with this piece? And what is that about the very origin of the game of chess? Well, let's start with that. I've talked about, especially when I talked about the board, I mentioned how what we understand of as chess is actually derived from a Middle Eastern game called Chaturanga. Very recognizable to what we have in our understanding of chess today. But Chaturanga is actually derived from an Indian game called Chaturanga. And if you look at this image right now, you'll see what's strange about Chaturanga is it looks almost like a four-player game. You've got our recognizable chess pieces in the corners and each a different color. What's going on there? The four pieces, now if you've been following this history, you know a little bit about each of these guys now. You have I'll go on this side I guess. You have the chariot, which we now know of as the rook. You have the horse, which we now know as the knight. You have the elephant, which we know as the bishop. And you have the Raja, which we know as the king. And if you go further back in this series, I talked about the front fellas, the infantry. They are the pawn now. How did that turn into Chaturanga, and how did Chaturanga turn into chess? I'm going to be probably revisiting this subject quite a few times as I go through these different videos, but because the queen is kind of really central to all of that, I need to bring up those two previous games again. Now, I think the easiest way to do this is, why don't I show you what those early adaptations of those games, how they then morphed into chess as we understand it today. Okay, so here we have our Chaturanga board. We've got one army here, one army here, an army here, and an army down in this corner. And remember, all these guys, like the Raja, the elephant, the horse, and the chariot, have got much reduced movement compared to what we're used to in modern chess. So, although it looks like these guys are going to bump into each other pretty quickly, their movements are much smaller than what we're used to. So, that's a factor. Now, you're probably playing Chaturanga in India, and no doubt at some point those boards and those pieces all travel farther to the west into the Middle East. And guys that discover these boards are thinking, oh, this looks like a really cool game. What are the rules and how do we play it? And I'm thinking at some point they probably either decided intentionally to make this two players with one army here and one army in the foreground, or maybe there was just not much instruction going around back then and they just thought, well, these are obviously supposed to go on either side of the board. So I'm just going to rearrange the pieces here to show what probably they ran into, the first issue that occurred with turning Chaturanga into Chaturanga. Here we have our pieces, and that's all fine and good, but the first thing you're going to notice is we got two kings. What the heck do we do about that? They probably had to decide, okay, how can both of these guys be in charge of the entire military? We can't really do it that way. What are we going to do? Well, one piece is going to have to be adjusted. And again, it's worth noting, just move the infantry, or what we call now the pawns, out of the way. The king's moves have not really changed at all. As per usual, he can only go one direction in any of the four, or even diagonally. He's only got these squares around him to move on. So what are we going to do about that? Well, why don't we make his other king, the second king, move only on the diagonals? We'll do kind of like what the elephant can do, but only move diagonally this way. One piece or one board movement at a time. Okay, sure, sounds great. What are we going to call this person that is also like the king? Well, who works with the king? We've got the minister, or, because this is Middle Eastern countries, the vizier. So one of these pieces had to get demoted down to the vizier, the second in command with the king. So they took away a king, or Raja, and they called the secondary piece the vizier. So here is the army of Shatranj, the pieces that eventually became chess, but with very different movements. And the newly named vizier would actually have very limited movement, as I say, only on the diagonal. After a while it was discovered it was taking a long time for this piece to become useful and to get to the other side of the board. So another modification to the rules was for the opening, the vizier was at least able to move 2 squares if necessary, or if desired. Kind of like in the modern chess rules, the pawn, if he wants to, can move either 1 square or actually has the option of moving 2 squares forward. Similarly, the vizier, although limited to 1 square most of the time, at least on an opening move could go 2 squares diagonally. Alright, you're saying, so that's the vizier, or the furs. How did his position change to becoming the wife of the monarch? And why the sudden sweeping changes in the amount of movement that the vizier, or that piece, is able to do? This is probably around the 12th century, possibly the 10th century. As Shatranj moved into Europe, there seemed to be this great adaptation of this great game, the Game of Kings. And I think what may have occurred is in that period, there was a lot of royal courtly protocols going on. There was also a very strong identification of a lot of European rulers and the people in general with the Virgin Mary, and how the idea of the Madonna was quite central to a lot of, certainly in the Mediterranean, a lot of the cultures and the societies around that period and that time. So when Shatranj was starting to be played, I think what may have occurred is you had this idea that this advisor to the king, who is this person? Who do we always see sitting beside the king at court? It's the queen. And there is actually a Swiss poem dated in 997 where that piece is for the first time referred to as the Regina, or the female monarch, the queen. I believe what must have been happening is these various monarchs are sitting around up in their tall castle and they're deciding, let's have this royal game. Who can I play it with? How about my wife? Yes. And probably the changing of who this advisor is to the king might have been inspired at that point. I believe what had occurred is the idea of the right-hand person of the king is the queen, and not this vizier, this more Middle Eastern kind of a person. That's probably where her identity became known as the female part. And what's also interesting is that seems to be around the same time, we're talking the 12th century-ish, her role, her movements vastly changed. She suddenly could move much like the bishop across the board. She began to move like the rook. The only part that she wasn't able to replicate was that of the knight, and yet, I'll get to it in a second, there was one section, there have been some records of the queen also being able to move like the knight. So suddenly, she has the power of every piece on the board, sort of, and this seemed to be quite an identifiable and recognizable thing in European courts, that they just decided, yes, that makes sense. Of course, the queen is, behind every great man stands a great woman, that kind of thing. Yes, the queen is the most powerful piece. One queen in particular seems to have been the major inspiration for all of this, and that is Isabella I of Castile. The Spanish queen, the very same Spanish queen that Christopher Columbus was funded by to go out and discover the New World in 1492. Isabella, when she came to power, she made sweeping reforms. She actually reduced a lot of the debt that the Spanish kingdom had been suffering from. She is a queen with a great deal of prowess and importance in history. And it is also around this time that this idea of this very powerful female monarch was starting to work its way into the chess pieces. Similarly, in 1492, in Spain, there was the expulsion of the Jews, who actually apparently took some of the chess rules with them as they spread across the rest of Europe. So again, this is probably why this proliferation of this important female figure actually began to become so widespread and well known. As a matter of fact, a good strong indicator of just how important the queen was at this time, there was actually a rule, much like if you were about to place the king into check. If you're about to place the queen into check, you actually had to say gardez la reine, or gardez, the sort of early version, I guess, of en garde. That was polite warning that you were about to take the queen, and in some rule books, you couldn't take her if you hadn't said that. It's kind of an interesting little quirk of chess history. The practice kind of got abandoned around the 19th century, but I find it fascinating. Let's talk about how the queen could at one time move like the knight. That was unusual and kind of regional in nature. And for that, we have to remember that the queen was the vizier throughout a lot of the East, or their name for the vizier was the Firs. Why is that important? Well, when I talked about this series in general for Chess Chest, I did mention a great resource of information for a lot of this stuff is this book right here, A History of Chess by H.J.R. Murray. On page 384, he does discuss chess in Asia, and one of the things that he brings up on this paragraph here, chess is so common in Russia that during our continuance at Moscow, I scarcely entered into any company where parties were not engaged in that diversion, and I very frequently observed in my passage through the streets the tradesmen and common people playing it before the doors of their shops or houses. The Russians are esteemed great proficients in chess. With them, the queen has, in addition to the other moves, that of the knight, which, according to Philidor, spoils the game, but which certainly renders it more complicated and difficult, and of course more interesting. There's further discussion, and there's a lot of annotations here, but there's a discussion here. In 1821, I. Butrymov, the author of the first Russian textbook of chess, which was naturally based upon Western European books, protested against the popular practice of giving the Firs the power of 3 pieces and allowing it to gallop like the Khan, or the horse, or knight. Dahl, the great Swedish lexicographer of Russia, in his Tolkovi Slovar, includes under Firs the phrase Firs, I can't even possibly pronounce that. In other words, all kinds of Firses, which again evidences the existence of varying powers of move. Uncertainty like this always points to a recent extension of move from that of the older game, a single diagonal step, to that of the modern game. Rather wordy, but yes, at one time, the furs, the queen, did actually move like the knight. And as a final interesting quirk about the queen, and I haven't really found anything to verify why this is, but when they brought the two sets of armies together and it was decided, well, which one is going to be the king and which one's going to be the vizier, it was decided that the one that we know of as the queen would actually be the one who sits on her own color. If you're playing this side of the board, the black queen goes on the black square. If you're on that side of the board, the white queen goes on the white square. There's a phrase in chess terminology that the shoes match the dress. So why that happened that way, I don't know if it's like something to speak to the power of this piece, or if over the years did these guys like have different positions and there were different rules and different changes, and maybe eventually they just thought, you know what, let's just make it so the queen is the one that sits on her own color. Probably at some point the board might have been rotated 90 degrees as well. You never know over time how people had set up their boards, but now the standard is the shoes match the dress. The queen sits on her own color. And that's the queen. We've discussed already how if a pawn gets to the opposite side of the board, it can be any piece and is quite often turned into a queen, which historically made some sort of eyebrows raise, the idea of the king having two consorts, because we all know that never happened in history. But I just thought, you know what, I've already covered that when I talked about the pawns. So the queen herself, that's where we're going to leave it for this one. And that leaves one piece left, the king. And he's also got a lot of interesting history to him beyond what we've already covered with these guys. So, again, apologies this one took a little while, but we're going to have more Chess Chest episodes in the very near future. And until next time, we'll see you down the rabbit hole.